If you want to keep up with the latest and greatest in the world of marketing, you're in the right place. This is Marketing Exploder. Excited to talk about naming and marketing. Yes. I think it's one of those things that I encountered when I was at a guitar company doing marketing for them. And the VP of marketing that I worked for would say, "Oh, naming's the hardest thing ever. We have to name this new product line. Let's do it." And so I was tasked with coming up with a name and brainstorming and all the sessions. And I was curious. I was like, are there people who out there that do this professionally?
Yes.
And now I meet you,
now
Stevie.
You know.
So I'm
now
curious,
you know.
Yeah. So I'm curious to know, did you stumble upon it, or is this something you grew up since a little girl? You said, I want to name things. Like, tell me, how did you get there?
No, and it's funny. I went back for my 15-year reunion, and people are so like awestruck that I'm a namer. They wanted me to do a presentation of like interesting like career opportunities that like the class has like entered into. But yeah, total happenstance. I actually graduated with like a creative writing degree. I went to a liberal arts school. Didn't know what I really wanted to do, but I thought, okay, something related to books. So I was like, publishing, yes. Became an editorial assistant in New York. Quickly learned I was a glorified secretary and would be for years. And so then I ended up taking some courses at NYU on branding, brand strategy, copywriting. They told me I was a terrible copywriter. And so after that, I made the choice. I know. And that was that's what I was like seeking out to do. Being a creative writer was like copywriting felt like, okay, that's where I should be, because I missed that creativity. But then I moved to San Francisco and I got a job at a branding firm as copywriter / namer, where copywriter was kind of held up as like the lead, where in reality the naming portion was really, really big for this firm. I mean, being in Silicon Valley with all the startups, I started out in like 2008, 2009. So as you can imagine, Microsoft was still humongous. It is still humongous, but there was Apple, there was Facebook coming up, there was all these other service providers for them, and tons of startups, right? Just popping up left and right. And branding, obviously, services a lot of startups, and names, they need names. So that's kind of how I got my start in naming. It wasn't expected. I didn't expect to necessarily like it, but I quickly found out I was pretty good at it. And so even though my career has kind of woven, I've worked largely in brand strategy. I worked at The Atlantic for a while doing more like content strategy. Naming has always followed me throughout.
Oh, awesome.
So yeah, I mean, I oftentimes will introduce naming practices to certain firms or like The Atlantic, and yeah, it's been with me through and through over the years, and yeah, total happenstance.
And you call it, and the title is namer. Then people
Namer.
who name things in the marketing industry call themselves namers.
Yes,
and how
namer.
did you even find resources to learn how to do that or to improve your skill? Did you have mentors or?
Mentors, for sure. So the lead creative on the copy and naming side at the brand or the firm I was at, it was Salt Branding, and I think they're still there. They're on Battery in San Francisco. I don't think all the same players and principals are there, but my mentor was Lauren Green. He went on to work for Adobe. I think he works more like a VP of strategy now. He's like on the strategy side, but he was actually a professor of rhetoric at Berkeley. So he knew words really, really well. And I guess it was just a lot of like learning on the fly. At that time, naming was very, very different. We had books, we had French, thesaurus. We had the Spanish thesaurus. We had a glossary of like indexing every single word in the English language categorized by species and products. And so there were a lot of like old school analog type things we were referencing at that time, but I just learned on the fly. I wish there were resources to say, this is how you become a namer, but it was really just tactics and strategies that, my mentor had learned that people prior to him had learned to basically, make this craft, I guess, a craft to elevate it,
Wow. That's amazing. So, do you have a sort of systematized way that you go about? Like, what is a typical, approach for you when a brand says, I need to name this new product, or I don't know. It extends beyond product, I'm assuming.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it's company, sometimes it's product. I know we're hearing, a lot of people have internal AIs that they use now, and we name internal things. It could be an org or a part of an org, within the organization. So anything can have a name, features can have a name, functions, benefits. It's really dependent. I mostly focus on the company and then the product side of things. In terms of like process to get to those, it's all very, very similar. I mean, very similar probably to PR or anything in marketing. There's going to be a brief, right? You're getting with a client, you're understanding the clarity of their vision. What is the strategy? What is the brand strategy? With naming in particular, you're kind of extracting themes from that. So like, yeah, we want to be, this network for money. So you're like, oh, network. Okay. So then you go into like interconnections and you start making leaps metaphorically. And you're probably coming up with lists of like what we could potentially explore. But a lot of it is desktop research. I mean, I'm sitting at my desk. I might be using tools like Word Hippo, which is just like, a thesaurus online. If a company is looking for a rhythmic name like Fitbit or GoPro, or even one with alliteration like Firefox, right? I might tap into rhymezone.com. There's onelook.com. So there's a lot of tools us namers use that nobody knows about, or they do know about loosely and they might not use them as much. I use ChatGPT. I don't think it's actually very good if you are not a namer to use that, because you need to come in with very
Oh, okay.
precise inputs. Yeah, you need to come in with precise inputs. You can't just say, hey, I am naming X healthcare company and they want to sound trusted, right? Or I am naming this new technology in data and they want to be, at the forefront, because you're going to get things like data forward or like data reach or data advance where it's not creative. It feels a little generic. So you kind of have to wiggle your way around ChatGPT to get to like the result you ultimately want. So it's really it's like highly prescriptive on my end of what I'm asking it to do, as opposed to being like this big, vague, open-ended question. I'm never like, help me name X. They want to say XYZ. It's more like, hey, this company works in data. What are words associated with data? Then I take those words and then I'll be like, okay, now what can I pair with that? And then I might go back, or I might say like, hey, I want it to be like a portmanteau, which would be a combination of words like pro and momentum, promentum when you're bringing them together. And then I will ask it to do that.
Right.
But there's a lot more of like, yeah, there's a lot more thinking that has to be done to utilize ChatGPT for naming in the right way. So I do use it. I'm trying to think what else. I often am also looking within the industry and at competitors' social media, just looking for interesting words, turns of phrases that are being used that maybe could be lifted to become a name. That's kind of the process when it comes to the
That
actual
that's
naming and the
amazing.
creative portion. Yeah. Yeah. And a lot of it is
Yeah.
iterative. So I'll
That,
always, have a long list and I'll go through it and then I'll start thinking of more things as I go through it. Yeah.
right. And how do you get to a conclusion? I mean, I would imagine that you're doing multiple rounds of presenting something back
Yes.
to a client, and then they say, we love it, we hate it, or go in this direction. I mean, what do you find once you've landed on, whatever you're going to take to the client? What does that look like, and where does the process go from there?
Yeah, I think it varies based on client and what they're looking for. Some clients want to cull through a very long list of names and pick the names they like the best and send them off to screening. So sometimes I will deliver lists between 500 and 1,000 names to a client. They paid for a round. That's what they're going to get. And I'll elevate what I think is strategically sound, right? And say, I think these are the strategically sound names. They align with your, your vision, your message, the tonalities we want to hit. But they ultimately do the final decision making, the refinement on their end. They may come back to me and say, hey, we love XYZ. Can you do some more around that? And then I'll iterate, right? In other instances, it is doing these long lists and then based on the strategy, going through a round of refinement, saying, okay, these are our top 50 to 100 names, and they want them maybe pretty clear before they bring them to their final legal counsel. So I'll do Google knockout screens or preliminary trademark search to get them down to maybe 20 to 40 names that seem legally viable. Not they ultimately have to do their own screening. I'm not a trademark lawyer. But yeah, that's how we get to that point. But usually there's that feedback loop built in. So you're like working from a very wide funnel. Like say you might have 5 messages you want to talk to and maybe 3 tonalities. You do one round and then the client comes back and says like, hey, we like 3 of these 5 and we like only this tone. And so then you're like continually refining, until you get to that exact point or that final name. And it may not be one final name. It's usually 5 to 7. And then they bring those to legal for final check. And there's also other considerations, which I'm sure we'll talk about, like URL, right? And things that may knock a name out because they want a direct URL or the URL even with an appendage. So say it's a name plus health as like a descriptor.com. Even that, it may not be available or it may be too long, So, yeah.
Right.
Hopefully that answered that one.
Does this happen where, yeah, well, I've heard from people that are in kind of a similar industry where they're doing, let's say, logos for a brand or for a company.
Yeah.
And they go through this whole process and then it, ends up that the CEO, says, actually, can we just go with, what my cousin drew on a napkin at a bar? I really like this.
Yeah.
Do you ever have anybody completely at the end of the day, they're holding on to a name and they finally go, you know what? I think I'm just going to do with the thing I've been,
Yes, that's happened multiple times in the last 3 years, but I think a lot of times the client will be forthright. Usually I ask, have you done a naming exploration? Of that naming exploration, do you have a preferred name or preferred names? And they'll say, yes, we did one and we really like these names. I don't want the whole list because then it ruins my own creative process. Might be led to create more names like X or Y or Z. But yes, oftentimes when that happens, the client is a little, if I'm asking that, they are forthright saying like, hey, yes, we have this other name. We really like this name. This is more of a due diligence exercise. We want to turn over every stone, make sure we're not missing anything. Right. We want to make sure it's kind of like proof of concept. Does what we think will work, will it work in the long run? I have also seen clients hold on to names that I don't think are very good because they love them so much because they came up with them, So it's hard, right. And so I write, I write on the side, I write poetry, I write essay and nonfiction, and we always say you have to kill your darlings. And for some people, it's very difficult to kill those darlings. So yeah.
I know my personal experience, I grew up, songwriting and playing in bands. And so, that whole process where you talk about, finding words and thesauruses and things like that, I'm very familiar. It's what you hear as the final product out there, especially like a radio hit, or when you see a brand out there. I think sometimes people think I could have written that song or I could have come up with that name. But the real answer is, yeah, but you didn't, and
yes.
And there was a whole process to brainstorm and trim things down. And, they say something like, if I had more time, it would be shorter or what. And that's kind of, I think, the opposite in the world now where people feel like, oh, I have AI now. I should be able to come up with this in no time.
Yeah, I think on AI, I think AI is great at some things. I think AI is excellent at writing and writing emails, for naming, we present names for writing rationales for those names, like making an argument or a case for a name. I think the writing capacity of AI is really good. What it's not good at, and I think this is interesting because I being, having a poetry background, I played around with it with poetry, and it's terrible at writing poetry. It cannot write poetry at all. And I feel like in the same vein, it cannot do naming because I feel like they are similar in a lot of respects. And I wrote an article with the subtext about how naming and poetry are linked in many ways. But when it comes to poetry, it's really hard to distill. And I mean, poetry is trying to name the unnameable, right? Grief, the hard stuff, grief, death, child loss. It's tackling really difficult and complex things in the same way that a name is taking all of these components of brand. I want to be, a challenger brand. I want to say connectivity, but I also have to say, we're trustworthy. And you're trying to take all of these things and just distill into a single word or a composite word where there's like two words blended together. And I don't think ChatGPT is good at that narrowing and that refining process to really hit it tonally. I think is where I'm going. Tonally and also the essence. I don't think it's there yet. I think it will be there soon, but not quite yet.
Wow. That's, yeah, it's nuance, really. And I think
Mhm.
anybody who, for example, speaks another language knows that they know how the same words translated don't have the same tonality
Yep.
and need to be, translated in a different way. And I think that's the same thing with brand names. It's very hard, especially if you're a brand that doesn't exactly know who you are yet. Do you ever have to turn a brand away or tell them to kind of go back and really figure out, well, what do you want to convey here, because we can't be everything to everyone?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've never turned a brand away, but I do from the get-go get, an understanding of what they have under their feet, so to speak. Sometimes they have done brand strategy. Once they've done a brand strategy project or if they've done a lot of strategy and research work and are coming to me and feeling confident about that, and I can see those materials and I'm like, this is great. They have a codified and clarified vision. They basically can come to me and say, this is our recipe. And then I just go off and cook, right? So like for those clients, we can do a quick briefing
Yeah.
session. Usually I take the recipe, I go cook. Then I have other clients that are like, hey, we're not quite sure. Maybe we didn't do a full brand strategy or the strategy sucked, whoever did the strategy. And they're coming to me and they're like, yeah, we have the strategy. I'm like, this means nothing. It is like it's totally vapid and like void of meaning. But then, in talking with them, I know they desperately need a name. They have a deadline to hit, they have other things to hit. So for those clients, I tend to do a workshop because they may loosely know the recipe, but not the recipe in full, right? They may want instead of sugar, maple syrup, instead of maple syrup, agave, and how much and how little. And through that workshop, we create the recipe together, and then I go off and cook. So it's I would never turn
Wow.
them away. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of times too, with startups or with all businesses, they're pushing toward a deadline, right? There's either the launch, right, big launch, or maybe there's conferences that they want to announce things at, and so you are always working toward that deadline, and it's a matter of like helping them get what they need to get there. And so like when you do those sorts of workshops, they're getting a little more bang for their buck because ultimately they're getting a little bit of strategy, a little bit of messaging, even though they don't know it, leading into the naming exercise.
That's amazing. Well, thank you so much. I learned so much, and I definitely am going to change my approach next time I have to come up with a name. I might have to just call you.